Welcome, everyone. I'm Glenn Branch, Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education, and we're thrilled to have you joining us for our Scope Centennial webinar series in which we continue to explore the legacy and ongoing relevance of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. This webinar is the third of three sessions that address the past, present, and future in this 100th year since the first major battle over evolution education in the United States. Today's session, The Scopes Trial, the Start of America's 100-Year Culture War, features Adam Laats, Distinguished Professor of Education and History at Binghamton University. Adam's books include Creationism USA, Teaching Evolution in a Creation Nation, written with Harvey Siegel, and Fundamentalism and Education in the Scopes Era. And he's also a recipient of NCSC's Friend of Darwin Award. Before we get started with today's webinar, a few quick notes. If you missed any of the webinars, or if you want to revisit any, each of the three webinars will be available via NCSC's website very soon. If you'd like for us to continue to make opportunities like this possible, please continue making a donation to NCSC. Your support truly makes a difference. There will be a Q&A at the end of today's talk. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll pass them along to Adam as time allows. Thanks again for joining us. Now let's get started.
Hello, everybody. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be part of the NCSC's Scope Centennial series. I'm really grateful to the NCSC for all the work that they do in society, but also for me, I've just learned so much from all their events and programming and publications that I'm really honored to be a part of this. I should start with full disclosure of my terrible secret. But I won't. I'll save that in case we get time. I will say, though, this summer, for those of you who are, interested in the Scopes trial and the history of creationism and evolution education, it has been a great summer with a lot of great talks, a lot of great publications about this history. And for me personally, I am really happy to get a chance to talk about it because I do think it is enormously important, the Scopes trial that is, it's enormously important to understand the U.S. In the 1920s, but more than that, to understand the 100 years ever since. Sometimes today's headlines, and to be fair, 1955 headlines and 1995's headlines have been perplexing beyond anything else. And I think understanding the roots of these conflicts, these culture war conflicts in the Scopes trial, goes a long way to helping make some sense, maybe not solve the problems, but at least make some sense of how these things have evolved over time. And I also, in all seriousness, want to start with a heads up. I'm going to be talking a lot about the ugly culture wars of the 1920s, and there's a lot of difficult to hear language in there. It's very racist, and there's even sexual violence talk of. And I think it's important to look at it in all of its reality. But I just want to let you know that some of the language it's difficult for me to say. I'm sure it may be difficult for you to hear. But I'll include it just so we can get a full sense of the world of the Scopes trial and the roots of our 100-year culture war. And what I'd like to do with this talk is two things. The first thing I'd like to do, because I think it helps us really understand why the Scopes trial mattered so much and why it still matters. I'd like to look at the many meanings of the word evolution in the world of the Scopes trial, in the world of 1925 America. Yes, of course, it was about actual evolutionary theory. It was. But if we look at it just about actual evolutionary theory, the Scopes trial makes no sense. As some of the prominent scientists at the time said, this is not really a controversy at all. The things that people are accusing evolution of. It also, though, goes beyond just the world of conservative religion. The Scopes trial often is portrayed correctly as a fight between science and religion. That's true. But if you stop there, we don't understand what happened at the time and why it matters ever since. So I'll start with taking a look at what evolution meant in America in 1925. That's part one. Part two, I will look at one of the institutions that happened only because of the Scopes trial. And I'll try to make the case that the birth of these institutions is the sort of most important part of the trial's legacy. The Scopes trial birthed these set of alternative institutions so that as America fought culture wars, each side had these long lasting, powerful institutions to draw on and to fight from. So that'll be the second part. So, okay, I'll take you back 100 years to start because in some ways the world of the Scopes trial feels eerily familiar. And a lot of these things you may be familiar with. So, number one, at the time of the Scopes trial, the United States and the world was about 5 years out of a global pandemic. The Spanish flu at the end of World War One, killed millions of people, but it also had a massive impact on culture. Everything was closed down. People were wearing masks. There was fear. There was political uncertainty. And by the time of the Scopes trial, the U.S. was recovering, but still keenly aware of what felt like a new kind of menace. Second, and also difficult to hear, at the time of the Scopes trial, the United States every summer had been experiencing really brutal racial violence, especially in cities. Not just in cities, but it was most concentrated in cities. And part of the root of that was Chicago 1919. The spark that set off the violence in Chicago was fights about how white police treated black teenagers. In this case, you may know the story. There was a black teenager on a raft at a beach, and he floated into the supposedly white section of the water. A white man threw rocks at him, hit him, killed him. He fell off the raft and drowned. And there was no doubt about what happened. Black bystanders appealed to the police to do something to this murderer, and they refused. And this set off this wave of 1920s, Black Lives Matter protests and violence in cities across the country. Chicago was certainly not alone. St. Louis, Tulsa. The sense in 1925 was that America was in this agonizing moment of racial violence. And it mattered for immigration too. Race-based immigration laws had been passed recently, drastically restricting who could come and who could be an American to people from Northwest Europe, Germans, English, white people. And even, to me, even more sort of eerily similar, the Espionage Act made it legal to deport non-citizens for their political speech. So famously, non-US born residents like Emma Goldman were arrested for their political speech, put on boats, and shipped to Russia in this case, by the hundreds. Also, in the 1920s, you have a sense that universities were under attack, political attack. The cartoon here is one of my favorite for capturing the vibe at the time. So you see, this one, I got it from the Wall Street Journal. It ran in a bunch of places. It was called Education in the Higher Branches. And you can see the stereotype of the state legislature. This figure with the club is labeled state legislature, and he's depicted as a rural, lowly, uneducated legislator sicking his hunting dogs, anti this law, anti that law, on this professor type figure and chasing him up into a tree. So throughout the 1920s, throughout the world of the Scopes trial, there was a sense on one side that higher education should be attacked, and on the other side, a sense that higher education was justifiably under attack and was very uncertain of how to handle these attacks. Um, Last but certainly not least, there were a spate of violent white supremacist groups that had enormous political influence in the world of the Scopes trial. Most famously is one everyone has heard of. The Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s had millions of members. It ran the state governments of Indiana and Oregon. It was incredibly powerful, so much so that both of the main political parties in their 1924 conventions activists in both parties tried to insert a plank condemning the Klan's racial violence, but neither party could do it. Neither party was willing to take a stand against the Ku Klux Klan in 1924. So this is the world of the Scopes trial. The United States is reeling from pandemic. It's reeling from racial attacks, especially on Black Americans. It's expressing white, a lot of white conservative Americans are expressing this race-based anti-immigrant sentiment, and groups that are explicitly racist and explicitly violent, like the Ku Klux Klan, have enormous influence. Also similar is that all of these issues ended up being debated and fought as, yes, broad culture war issues. What should America do about race, immigration, citizenship? But they also got fought as battles over what schools should teach the young people about all of these issues. And evolution and the anti-evolution campaign of the 1920s was wrapped up entirely in this sense of a divided America. So let me share with you the way prominent anti-evolution campaigners in the 20s talked about evolution. So one of the most famous was a traveling evangelist named T.T. Martin. And this is his stand on the streets of Dayton at the time of the Scopes trial. T.T. Martin was a conservative Baptist preacher. He had been throughout the 20s making his living preaching about the dangers of evolutionary teaching. And his book, which, again, I don't share any of his ideas or politics, but it's a great book title, Hell and the High School. As a high school teacher, I can relate. A former high school teacher, I can relate. But let me share with you some of the really disturbing language that T.T. Martin used in his campaign against evolution to give you a sense of what people were talking about at the time of the Scopes trial when they meant when they said they were fighting evolution. So in this book, T.T. Martin preached that, quote, evolution is being drilled into our boys and girls during the most susceptible, dangerous age of their lives. And that sentiment was so powerful to Americans in 1925 and 2025 that basically all the sides agreed, not that evolution was bad, but that the teen years and the years of childhood were a particularly important time that children needed to be given the right type of moral information. I think clearly most of us still think that now. Childhood then and now was seen as a really particularly formative time. And for people like T.T. Martin, if kids were taught evolution, they would be harmed. So part of the harm was religious. Martin preached that if you learned evolution, you would become an atheist. He said he had, quote, abundant evidence that the teaching of these textbooks is unsettling the faith of thousands of students, end quote. And he never shared the evidence, but he said he had it. And for him, that was one of the key problems with evolution education. It was a religious problem. If you learned evolution, Martin preached, you would lose your faith. You would become an atheist. And we absolutely, that's the starting place to understand the Scopes trial and its legacy. But we can't stop there because Martin didn't stop there. And this, apologies, this is some of the language that's hard to hear. Listen to the way T.T. Martin talked about evolution educators. He called them evolutionists. And he didn't say, we disagree about these ideas, but we're all Americans and we can get along. No, not at all. T.T. Martin said evolutionists, quote, laugh and jeer, and again, apologies, laugh and jeer as the rapist laughs and jeers at the bitter tears of the crushed father and mother over the blighted life of their child. That's language that takes us way beyond educational policy. It takes us way beyond science pedagogy. It takes us way beyond, religious education. T.T. Martin in 1923, when he wrote this, and in 1925, when he kept preaching about it, was depicting evolution educators not just as people with whom we disagree, but literally as groomers, as sexual menaces to our children, as rapists of our children. If we miss that, we don't understand the world of the Scopes trial and the trenches that it dug for our continuing culture war. And there's more. And again, the language is hard for me to read, but he didn't just say he disagreed with evolution teachers. He said any men who supported the teaching of evolution, his word was they were sissy. They weren't real men. Another phrase, he said they had given up their Christian manhood. And then he just put everything he had into this attack. Uh, if you taught evolution, you were betraying, quote, the spirit of those who came over in the Mayflower. And he asked, where is the spirit of 1776? So, for those of you who are science teachers and evolution educators, the first and to me most obvious objection is, what does any of that have to do with any of this? And on the one hand, nothing. The spirit of 1776 has nothing to do with science education. In one hand, a logical hand. But in the world of the Scopes trial and in the world of American culture war sense, it has everything to do with it. And I'll share a few more examples before I expand a little bit. So let's look at higher education. We could go anywhere. A lot of universities, especially public ones, but also denominational schools, fought really bitter fights about what they called evolution education. I'm just going to pick one for the sake of time. We're going to look at the case in North Carolina. In North Carolina, you had a very powerful anti-evolution movement. They were very powerful in the state legislature, and they dictated a bunch of terms to the state university about what changes the university had to make in order to maintain its funding, to keep its funding. Yeah, no, I said 1925. But they were doing a very similar kind of culture war politics to what we're seeing today. If the universities don't take these steps, we will cut their funding. One of the steps, there were a few professors that the conservatives, the anti-evolution side, wanted to fire. One of them was an instructor named Albert Keister. He taught, and he didn't dispute this, he taught a group of pre-service teachers. They were going to be teachers. It was a group of all white women. He told them that the Bible, and this is the language he was accused of using, and he admitted using, the Bible was, quote, a form of mythology. So for saying, telling this group of college students that the Bible was a form of mythology, North Carolina's anti-evolution activists they told the university they had to fire Keister. And this seems like pretty standard part of the anti-evolution story. Conservatives considered the Bible their rock. They considered evolution a threat to a biblical kind of Christianity. And so when a student who took notes on this lecture and sent them to the fundamentalists reported that Keister had called the Bible mythology, they wanted him fired. That part makes perfect sense in the world of religion and science. But listen to what else they accused Keister of telling these students. They accused, and this isn't Keister's language, this is their language. They accused Keister of having, their word, infidel ideas about white supremacy. Now, they didn't say exactly what they meant. They didn't feel like they had to, but we can guess. For the anti-evolution activists had a strong presence in the state legislature, a professor who told students to question the racial hierarchy, to question the ideas of white supremacy, to anti-evolution forces, not only was that cause for firing, but they considered that part of the world of evolution education. If you're teaching our children that racism is wrong, fundamentalists in North Carolina thought, you're teaching that evolution stuff. Now, Keister did not lose his job. He kept his job thanks to his boss, this man, Harry S. Chase, the president of North Carolina and of the system. And Chase made a bold and eventually successful political defense. He said, yep, you've got the purse strings, but what we've got is a university, a modern research university. And he used the word that convinced enough North Carolina legislators to vote his way. He said, we can't fire professors for, these thought crimes if our state wants to have, and I'm paraphrasing all that, but this is the actual word he used. He said, if the state wants to have a quote unquote real university, if we're going to have a real university, we cannot fire professors for teaching students that racism is bad or that religion might be a myth. We can't do that. And Harry Chase won. He convinced enough North Carolinian legislators that they wanted to maintain, and he used the case of Tennessee as the counterexample. He said, we don't want to be like Tennessee. We want to have a real research university. So in the world of higher ed, evolution meant all of these things at the same time: anti-racism, um, actual evolutionary science, but also any sort of sentiment that traditional evangelical religion is something students might question. At the K-12 schools, the word evolution meant everything, like anything. Let me give you a couple of examples. So famously, several states passed anti-evolution laws, like Tennessee's, which led to the Scopes trial. But many, many more states debated bills. And when you look at the language of these bills, I think it tells us a lot about what evolution meant at the time of the trial. So the U.S. Congress, for example, debated two bills, one in 1924, one in 1926. At the time, the U.S. Congress directly controlled D.C. public schools. So they were talking about making laws to govern D.C.'s public schools. And in their 1926 law, which they called an anti-evolution bill, this is what it would have done. It would have banned teaching of, quote, disrespect for the Holy Bible. Okay, you can see how that would be sort of the religious opposition to evolutionary science. Disrespect for the Holy Bible, or that ours is an inferior government. So in the world of the 1920s, and I think this is what creates the sides of our continuing culture war. When people said evolution, yes, they meant evolutionary science. They meant a certain skeptical attitude about traditional religion, but they also meant a skeptical attitude about the United States government as it was. That there was no line for the legislators at the time. They knew what they meant. They meant an entire bundle of ideas. Yes, evolutionary science, but a whole bunch of things that went with it. It gets even more expensive. So in West Virginia in 1927, the language that they used to ban evolution was they were going to ban, quote, any nefarious matter, end quote, from their public schools. Any nefarious matter. And it was not to them by accident, or that they could have just copied other language that said specifically the teaching of human evolution, but that's not what they wanted to do. They wanted to be able to control what public schools would teach, and they wanted to be able to decide, and why they picked a word like nefarious. They wanted to be able to decide what was acceptable in public schools, what counted as knowledge, what counted as morality, and they wanted to be able to decide what wasn't. Florida had a similar bill. Florida had passed earlier a resolution expressing the legislature's disapproval of evolution education. But the 1927 bill was different. They, in 1927, wanted to ban the use or adoption for use of any textbook which contains vulgar, obscene, or indecent matter. And again, they talked about it, vulgar, obscene, or indecent matter. The proposals, the proponents of this bill called this their anti-evolution bill. But what it would have banned is anything that they considered unacceptable, vulgar, obscene, or indecent. Vague, so that it could include evolutionary theory, real evolution. But it could also include anything that they didn't like because that's what evolution meant to them at the time. Okay, so in short, I've got my eye on the clock. So in short, when we look at evolution's meanings in the 1920s, when we looked at the things that people at the Scopes trial thought when they thought about evolution, we have to include all these broad meanings. But we don't just have to list them because there's something that unites all of them on one side of these culture wars that we're still stuck in. And that is the sense that the anti-evolution side considered itself, however they defined it, they considered themselves the real Americans. So it meant a certain type of racial identity. It meant a certain type of religious identity. It meant a certain type of sexual identity. They meant that they were the ones who were supposed to be able to define what it meant to be an American. And they felt a sense of proprietary control over schools. The language is everywhere. They all talked about our schools. And so they didn't feel like passing a vague bill about banning nefarious matter. They didn't feel like that was too vague because they thought that they should be able to define what was okay and what wasn't. Evolutionary theory was part of what they saw as not okay. But to them, there was no separation between actual evolutionary theory and this host of other ideas that were considered to the anti-evolution forces in the 1920s beyond what schools should be doing. But we have to say, and of course, the 1920s are not the 2020s. Things were very different back then in important ways. So one of the important things that was different for the people at the Scopes trial was that the conservative side, the Make America Great side in the 1920s, the anti-evolution side, they were the side, they called themselves and considered themselves the side of the public schools. These days, we're kind of used to seeing conservatives as people who want to get rid of, for example, get rid of the Federal Department of Education. But in the 1920s, the opposite was true. So conservatives like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, the million-strong organization that neither major party was willing to condemn, they supported not just public schools in theory, but they actually called for the creation of a federal, well-funded Department of Education. And they thought they should have a Department of Education at the federal level because they thought they would control it. So that in the words of the leader, his name was Hiram Evans, and it's gruesome language, but here's how he put it. He said, "We want to, quote, take every child in all America and put him in the public school of America. We will build a homogeneous people. We will grind out Americans like meat out of a grinder." So in the 1920s, the anti-evolution conservative activists like Hiram Evans were also the side of public schooling, so much so that they campaigned in a lot of states for mandatory public schooling. I don't mean compulsory schooling. I mean only public schools. They tried to make private schools illegal. And they passed a law to that effect in Oregon, and they came close to passing it in 8 other states. The Supreme Court ruled the law unconstitutional. They said, no, you can't ban private education. But that was a very different world. a very different world of the 1920s. Um, Another big difference that we have to keep our eye on is at the time of the Scopes trial, you did not have something that we are in 2025 are so familiar with as part of our culture wars, and it defines our culture wars. And by that, I mean this entire set of alternative institutions that embody and institutionalize this anti-evolution sentiment. So, creation museums, creationist universities, creationist think tanks, creationist conferences, creationist everything. Um, that happened because of the Scopes trial. And I'd like to speak for a few minutes before I stop about one of, or what I think of as the most prominent and influential, and certainly an institution that, if we can understand how it works, we can see how the Scopes trial in 1925 laid the groundwork for the battles that we continue to be fighting. So I'm talking about a school in university now in South Carolina, Bob Jones University. This is a picture. I'm sorry, it's a bad picture. Like I took it with my phone. Of their science building. For those of you who aren't familiar with Bob Jones University, I'll lay out a sketch of what Bob Jones University has meant over the past 100 years. First of all, it was started directly because of the Scopes trial and the anti-evolution sentiment of the 1920s. The founder was, not surprisingly, a man named Bob Jones. And this is how he explained his decision to start a college. He said, quote, "Fathers and mothers who place their sons and daughters in our institution can go to sleep at night with no haunting fear that some skeptical teachers will steal the faith of their precious children." So for Bob Jones, the spectacle of the Scopes trial told him that America's colleges were no longer safe for his kind of people. And if his kind of people wanted a college education, they could not go to the University of North Carolina. They could not go to the University of Wisconsin or Harvard or any of these mainstream universities. Instead, they needed their own institutions. And certainly, Bob Jones University has been a bulwark of anti evolutionary science. But that's not it. I mean, that's not the only thing. Bob Jones University embodies this entire cluster that we talk about as anti evolution, but it has so many more meanings. Most infamously, just like the attacks on the University of North Carolina, race was a big part of how Bob Jones University defined itself. It wasn't unusual for a white Southern Baptist preacher to be racist in 1925. By 1960, however, things were starting to change. Obviously, things hadn't changed entirely. But Bob Jones Sr. in 1960 said, "We've seen what happens in Little Rock. We can't trust the federal government to protect white supremacy. We've seen what happens with Brown v. Board. We can't trust the Supreme Court. We need to declare for segregation." And in 1960, Bob Jones did. In a chapel talk, he asked, "Is segregation scriptural?" Meaning, does the God of the Bible want us to keep separate races? And his answer was yes. And in the world of Bob Jones University, once Bob Jones Sr. said that something was scriptural, that meant they could not, they couldn't veer from it. They couldn't vary from it. So Bob Jones University maintained its racial segregation. It did a few things in the 70s to try to, to act like it was integrating, but it wasn't really. And recently, in 2017, it got back its tax-exempt status. But still, throughout the 20th century and long into the 21st, the core of Bob Jones University, what it's best known for, yes, it's anti-evolutionary science. It's also anti-racial integration. But that's not it. Just like in the 1920s, evolution meant everything all at once. That's what Bob Jones University meant. At Bob Jones University, in addition to creationism, in addition to segregation, there were and are incredibly rigid rules for dating, how a male and female students could date. And they were encouraged to date, but only this is just the first few pages of the 1933 rule book of how you could date. When I was there studying in the archive, I didn't go to school there, but studying in the archives, there was still, in the 21st century, there was still just one path where students could walk at night and hold hands, and it was well lit. Um, so there were so many rules about dating that Billy Graham, when he went to school there, he still went to school for only a little while. Billy Graham left because it was too strict. Billy Graham, Billy Graham thought it was too religious. So this is the world of Bob Jones. And of course, creationism is a big part of the evolving world of Bob Jones University, not just as a hub for a million creation conventions and debates between one type of creationist and another, which it certainly was, but also as a school, as a university. They trained generations of science teachers, creation science teachers, that worked in all kinds of schools. And this certainly was a big part of what the Bob Jones University world meant. But politics too. Throughout the 20th century, Bob Jones University had an enormous political influence, and by the 1970s, it was on one party, on the Republican Party. So those of you who are not old might not remember Strom Thurmond, but Strom Thurmond was an incredibly influential senator from South Carolina, and he was incredibly tight with the folks, the leaders of Bob Jones University. So much so, this is the wedding ceremony. Strom Thurmond's second wedding, scandalously, he married at age 66 Miss South Carolina, who was 22. It was a Bob Jones University administrator who performed the wedding ceremony for Strom Thurmond's second marriage. And it's a symbol in my mind of how close knit the world of Bob Jones was, as radical as it was, as racist as it was, as creationist as it was. They had friends not only in the White House, but also in the Senate. Most influential leaders of the Senate were best friends with the leaders of Bob Jones University. And we can't not talk about another term that was almost as influential as evolution in the world of Bob Jones. Evolution meant everything they didn't like, but there was another word that also meant everything they didn't like: communism. The archives at Bob Jones University are filled with a certain type of anti-communist literature that specifically counterposes a Christian country, which they thought America was and must remain, versus communism. And to my mind, one of the strangest things in the politics of today is hearing in 2024, 2025, uh, 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 prominent leaders condemning their enemies as communist. It doesn't make a ton of sense in one level, but if you understand the world of these institutions, it makes perfect sense. Communism is almost as flexible an accusation as evolution. It means in this world almost anything you don't like. All right, so I've got my eye on the time. Let me share, though, another bit for you of how the world of Bob Jones worked. Bob Jones University was it survived and thrived and was incredibly powerful. It combined all of these elements of anti-evolutionism seamlessly, but it also did it with a certain structure, which is that it had one charismatic leader who would make decisions, like Bob Jones in 1960 declaring that segregation was a scriptural necessity. When these charismatic leaders made statements, the rest of the university had to scramble to keep up. And some of the statements are truly shocking to me as a researcher, and yet the rest of the university world, Bob Jones University world, had to say, "Yep, that's what we think." For example, in 1970, armed National Guard troops shot and killed 4 students, as you know, at Kent State University, and then later at 2 at Jackson State University. Bob Jones Jr., who took over the role from his father, Bob Jones Jr. said, and I'm quoting, those young people, and again, sorry for the language here, those young people should have been shot, and the country is better off without that kind of young person. For Bob Jones Jr., as the president in 1970 of Bob Jones University, this was the level of his a radical anti-evolutionism. It meant people at all those other colleges, they've been taught evolution. And by evolution, he meant a certain type of uh, amoral animal behavior. And it was so intense for Bob Jones Jr. that he thought they should be shot and killed for it. And he blamed their professors, their ungodly professors who taught them things like evolution and he didn't use the word, but infidel ideas like we saw in 1925. So I'll wrap up and open some time for question, but I'll just make this main point again. We do not understand the culture wars that have been part of American society for the past 100 years if we don't understand the world of the Scopes trial. And we don't understand the world of the Scopes trial if we don't understand what evolution meant in 1925 and ever since. So in 1987, for example, at one of these many creation science conferences, this was their brochure advertising it. They have the Red Knight of Creation Science. And yes, he's attacking evolution, for sure. But check out the tree. When they said they're attacking evolution, they meant everything they didn't like. And it had changed since 1925, but that idea hadn't changed. So the branches, sexual perversion, radical feminist movement, Nazism, but also communism and pornography, drug culture, paganism. Um, in 1987, as much as 1925, as much as 2025, the anti-evolution campaigns have been, yes, about evolutionary science, but we don't understand them unless we understand how broad and all-encompassing that animus was. So let me stop there, and I would look forward to hearing any questions.
Thanks very much, Adam. That was great. And we do have some questions queued up for you. I'll start with this one. Do you think the teaching of evolution is in danger under Trumpism? And I specifically emphasize Trumpism, thinking beyond the life of President Trump.
Right. Well, I mean, I have been surprised that traditional creationism has played. Oh, let me stop this sharing here. Um, so we can, okay. I've been surprised that traditional, 20th century creationism has played less of a role, and that some of our current creationist celebrities, like Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis, have played less of a role. However, if you are familiar with the world, you know that our current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, was the legal representative of the Creation Museum before he took his current role. And so certainly I think that the vibe of creationism, including the radical young earth kind of creationism, is part and parcel of Trumpism, not just President Trump. And if I can share, so one of my creationist correspondents, I don't know if people remember Don McElroy. He was in the early 2010s, he was the president of the State Board of, or the chairman of the State Board of Education in Texas. And he and I corresponded for many years. And in 2016, at the first election of President Trump, um, he was an enthusiastic Trump supporter. And I asked him because I was surprised. I knew he was, a Sunday school teacher, a very moral person. And I asked him, for secular people like me, I said, what's, the $64,000 question? Why do you support this man who makes no pretense toward traditional Christian morality? And his answer, I think, is telling for this question of creationism with Trumpism. Dr. McElroy said, President Trump is the first politician that I have ever felt is fighting for me. So, how will creationism fare against Trump? Under Trumpism? This is why I think we need to take this broad understanding of what evolution means to anti-evolutionists. if you think back to the Red Knight chopping down the tree, for people like Dr. McElroy, today's creationists, um, the Dobbs decision against abortion rights is a victory in I don't want to put words in their mouths, but in many people's minds, that's a creationist victory because that's a victory for the side that includes evolution or creationism, but it also includes traditional Christian teaching in school, the limiting of abortion rights, the limiting of LGBTQ rights and representation, renewed hardening of racial hierarchies and attitudes about racial hierarchies. So specifically with creationism, I've been surprised haven't seen more of it. But for the creationist side, we've seen all of it. So what's going to continue to happen, in my opinion, is going to be that the tree that creationists are worried about, the branches will be continued to be attacked. And it might not be done in the language of creationism, but many radical creationists that I talk to see it as a victory.
You mentioned the flu, you mentioned race relations, but what influence, if any, did World War I have on the culture wars of the 1920s?
Enormous, certainly. The historian George Marsden has done such a great job, back in the 80s, and then his recently reissued book talks does such a great job of looking at the cultural impact of World War One, specifically on issues of creation and evolution, but also just more broadly in terms of um, uh, radicalizing and pushing the sides to a kind of more violent language. So certainly, evolution was accused in the world of 1920s. Evolution was accused of being a German import by many anti-evolution fighters, and that's partly because since World War One, it became a general term of insult to call things German. And there was enough evidence that they could look at, prominent German scientists who had promoted evolutionary thinking that, the language of World War One, it was easy to attack evolution as a German import. But that also meant bringing in, we saw with T.T. Martin's language, there was a violence and a vigilantism that came in the U.S. with World War One. Dissenters lost their jobs, but more importantly, people were attacked, literally tarred and feathered, if they weren't supporting the U.S. war effort and this sort of anti-German cultural purge. That attitude of, us versus them was really heightened in World War One, and I think it became part of the viciousness and the violence of groups that included groups that were involved in the anti-evolution culture wars.
The distinguished evolutionary biologist Douglas Fulma writes in 1983, I wrote a book, Science on Trial to Answer Creationism. At that time, the Institute for Creation Research was the most prominent face of creationism. Is it still active? Are there other such organizations beyond Bob Jones?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for participating in that question. The part of the important um, lesson from this 100-year culture war is that we don't and shouldn't focus on any one institution. Bob Jones, for me, is a good typical example. But Henry Morris, the leader of ICR, has certainly faded in his impact. But his protege, Ken Ham, has to my mind, even become a more prominent face of this type of young Earth creationism. Henry Morris's the museums that he put together were not much. But Ken Ham in Answers in Genesis has put together, as you're probably aware, these lavish the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, the Creation Museum in Kentucky. So, and I was just watching the Brewers, go Brewers, and they were playing the Reds, and behind home plate was an advertisement for Ken Ham's. I forget which one it was, Ark Encounter, I think. So Certainly, Henry Morris is sort of lost his prominence as a radical creationist leader, but Ken Ham has taken his place, and I would be shocked and surprised if there weren't, uh, another generation to follow, especially in our current culture where we have these dominant influencer voices, where it's numbers that give you the power. University-wise, too, Bob Jones University is still thriving, but more prominent has become other names like Liberty University, which just has more money and has a broader influence on things like college sports. So certainly there's a host of institutions that we could talk about.
And speaking of institutions, what roles do megachurches play in perpetrating anti-evolutionism? My understanding is many of the megachurches mostly spread a feel-good, positive thinking message with Christianity as a thin veneer.
Yeah, absolutely. You I think we exist in a similar world to the world of the 1920s, where you have very different faces, and often it's the face that is most influential. So today's mega churches, I think, would love to have the influence of a 20th century person like Billy Graham. Billy Graham preached to stadiums, and he met with presidents, and his appeal, he was no less creationist than, say, Bob Jones. He was no less fervent about it, but he talked, and certainly he was no less anti-communist than anyone. But his appeal was positive, and I think a lot of today's the mega churches, they do a similar family-friendly, positive experience, and some of them are, and they're all very different. Some of them are very light on culture war talk. Some of them go heavier, and in some places it's just implied. So I don't know where you live, but still there's plenty of places where the first thing you'll hear when you move in is like, where do you fellowship? And it's a way to ask somebody, what's your deal with all of these issues? So certainly, megachurches are tend to be more Billy Graham than Bob Jones, and it depends on which church. But I think if you get into the causes that they support, some of them are just as radical as anything you'd see at the more in-your-face institutions.
And let's try to squeeze in one more. Several people have asked similar questions. Can you say something about the shifting role of racism? Because you said back in the day of the Scopes trial, the creationists were racist, but so too were some of the evolutionists. And moreover, in the Red Knight, we saw that one of the evil offshoots of evolution was racism.
Right, thank you. It's a really great question, fundamental question, and really hard to get our heads around, to get my head around. One of the things that I think is most important is that in the world of the Scopes trial, both major parties were split on all these culture war issues and including race issues. So the Democrats had conservatives and liberal wings, and they were kind of regionalized. Republicans, same thing. You had more liberal and more conservative Republicans. All of these culture war issues, including race, split both of the main parties. Since about 1970s, uh, the culture war issues, including the racial ones, have become partisan separations as well. So that you have one of the major parties representing one side of many of these culture war issues and another party representing the other side. With race, it's particularly tricky because the more conservative side, including creationists like Ken Ham and the Red Knight, they also portray themselves as the anti-racist side. But what they mean by racism tends to be very different than what I think is a meaningful discussion of racism. So, for example, um, in the world of young Earth creationism, it is one school of thought now is that they're the only anti-racists, because they're the only ones who say that all of humanity came from two people. So we're all brothers, we're all sisters. But it's a certain type of anti-racism, which the implied next sentence is, so stop talking about race. We're the anti-racists because we're creationists, they say. So therefore, racism isn't real. Therefore, let's not focus on racism and let's stop doing things like, preferential college admission that could be preferential by race, for example, and things that we're seeing as policy coming out of the current administration. So it is a very difficult world because now both sides portray themselves as the real anti-racists. But in my mind, the conservative side's anti-racism generally tends to imply that we need to stop talking about race, which I think is a not a fruitful way to move forward towards a better racial equality.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's all we have time for. Then we have questions. Thank you again, Adam, and thanks everyone for attending tonight's webinar. If you missed any of the webinars in this series or you want to revisit any, each of the webinars will be available via NCSC's website very soon. If you enjoyed this event, please help us offer more of them in the future. Our work to promote science literacy and challenge threats to science education is funded by people like you. We invite you to make a contribution today at ncsE.ngo/donate-scopes-2025. And for those of you who already support our work, thank you. Good night.